Hi, my name is Eric Hofbauer. I'm a guitarist, improviser, composer, and educator, and I'm speaking today from the American Academy of Arts and Letters in the Charles Ives room, and I'm going to have a little lecture demonstration, if you will, or conversation about Charles Ives and the relationship between improvisers, particularly in the jazz idiom, and his legacy and his composing and some of the overlapping vocabularies that he used at the turn of the century that are now common tongue, if you will, or common kind of usage for what you would call, what the Academy may call postmodern improvisers or post-style jazz players. And if I can pull out for a second before I get into some of the details and maybe playing the guitar and demonstrating that, I kind of see this relationship between jazz improvisers and Charles Ives on this big arc that spans across the 20th century. And there's this overlapping relationship that his pieces and kind of his Ivesian sound world share with jazz improvisers, in particular, that developed about a century later. And it's almost like I see it as kind of completing a circle where there's these very divergent paths. In fact, I think you could make the argument that there was, for a long while, a great deal of independence. And, Charles Ives and jazz, those two languages or those two worlds were not necessarily overlapping in the early days of, especially of jazz, if you think of the 20s and the swing era and beyond. But then there's a series of innovations that come along in jazz history that had existed in the pieces of Ives, especially his work between 1900 and about 1915 or so. And it's quite striking that there's these parallels or these overlaps, these intersections perhaps of language, of techniques, and of kind of sound worlds. And one of the questions I have as an artist and an improviser in this space is, it's almost like this chicken and egg conundrum, kind of which came first. We know historically which came first, the Charles Ives language, but in terms of like the jazz world, which came first? Was it jazz musicians discovering Ives? Was it just the natural course of innovation within that music, and then musicians start to connect the dots and say, but there was this American composer named Charles Ives that was doing this too, and then it kind of feeds off itself. That, in my opinion, deserves a lot more scholarly research. I think there's some interesting questions to explore there. But on this big arc idea, what I kind of hear and see in the music and in the playing of both jazz innovators and Charles Ives is this relationship with sound that is built on juxtaposition. And in part of my talk today, or part of my demonstration, I actually want to use a stronger word, which is contradiction. And I think this is what brings both jazz as an American music and Charles Ives as an American composer. It brings out the Americanness because we are not a monolithic culture, and we have not been since the onset, and that creates a space, a cultural space and a social space of conflict and contrast and contradiction. So whether you're talking about the understanding of what race, gender, class, democracy, capitalism is, those are big picture things. I don't mean to get philosophical here, but it frames it. And these are the worlds that, American artists live in, and that is part of the intangible Americanness when you try to pin it down. When I try to pin it down as an American improviser in the 21st century, it's something I think about a lot, is the role contradiction plays and the role juxtaposition plays in the art I create, but also in the mentors that I've studied from and studied their music, like Ives. And it's something that I think unifies the present jazz improviser, the present modern day post-style improviser with 100 years ago. And so this is what I mean by it's completing the circle. There's this space in the middle where kind of Ives was existing and jazz was existing. And then they start to come together in the 1960s, 70s. So let me frame it really quick. All right, so Charles Ives puts out this massive body of work at the turn of the century, the first couple decades. But as most of us know who are Ives aficionados and students of the music, a lot of it was in obscurity until much later in his career. Meanwhile, jazz was existing on its own trajectory, in its own path, starting out as very popular dance music, not really employing the elements of some of the most avant-garde kind of daring spaces that Ives is working in. But that's coming. And then you have this pivot point. And I would say it starts post-World War II in jazz, where jazz itself becomes much more modernist and much more experimental, starting with bebop, focusing on harmony, then pivoting into things like rhythm, time, polytonality, polytime, all these very complex layers of dissonance and the role of rest and motion that we associate with the free jazz and experimental music of the 60s and 70s. If you look closely to a lot of those artists that are practicing in that space, definitely by the 70s and into the 80s, you start to get musicians that have checked out Ives and know of his innovations. And so this is where things get kind of blurry and very interesting as the circle starts to close, because there were hints of polyrhythms or really abstracted chord substitutions or polytonality starting in the 50s, getting into the 60s with free jazz, with Ornette Coleman and others. And there's a certain kind of information gap that gets closed. And the jazz musicians of the later generations are checking out bebop, free jazz, other experimental music, and avant-garde American music, starting with Ives. And here's where things really start to get interesting, because there's this, for me personally, I almost hear it or see it on the score or hear it in the music as a validation of artistic exploration of contradiction and juxtaposition, outside of the normal convention of harmony has to be, 4-5-1, or this, or has to do this, or has to do this, or rhythm has to be steady and the groove has to stay the same the whole time. Because as you push past kind of an overt commercialism, in the American arts, things get a little dicey, right? And so you look towards, where's a place to hold on to as an American artist that's pushing the boundaries? And you're like, oh, okay. At the turn of the century, there's, Ives, who has done all these things already in composition. And as an improviser, again, I'll speak primarily for myself, and some of my colleagues that we've had these conversations, it gives you a sort of confidence. It's like, oh, this is what you do. Like, this is okay. It's been proven to be in a sonic space that can work, that you can still find room for individuality. And so by the time we get to the 90s and into the 21st century, you have actually a whole generation and a new one on the way that is definitely far more versed in Charles Ives' repertoire and Charles Ives' techniques than the jazz musicians of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So this is what I mean by the circle is closing. So there's, at the end of the century, all of a sudden you have this space in so-called post-style or postmodern jazz improvisation where it is very common practice to do the type of harmonic juxtapositions, rhythmic juxtapositions, and textural or sonic juxtapositions or contradictions that Charles Ives was using a century before. And so what I want to do now is spend some time getting into those details, kind of highlighting a couple of his pieces, some short excerpts, just to highlight exactly what I mean. Because in these details, I think, is where we get really we can tease out some really interesting concepts and techniques that improvisers use, like I said, in a very, honestly, like everyday practice for musicians of this century, improvisers of this century. So I've broken it down into kind of a couple spaces. First, let's kind of frame where contemporary improvisation of the last, I think it's safe to say now, 50 years, and Charles Ives of the first 2 decades of the 20th century. When we've kind of framed those two moments in time, in musical time, we're really framing a juxtaposition of two spaces, Ives' repertoire, Ives' pieces, and post-style improvisers that are trying to find a sense of individuality or innovation or something new or something fresh, certainly something creative, by juxtaposing roots and, quote, avant-garde or modernism or postmodernism, like something daring, just deconstruction. Let's even just use that phrase. And so taking something that's rooted in the past. For jazz, it's things like the blues, pentatonic scale, a great American songbook, a certain sense of harmony that's rooted in the first half of the 20th century, 2/5/1 progressions and things like that. A connection to popular music or certain dance rhythms. And so it's rooted in that. It's rooted, especially if you focus on the blues as its folk roots. It really speaks to a certain simplicity, and out of that simplicity is birthed complexity or experimentation. Charles Ives, not, in his life and his composing years, the blues was barely out of the Mississippi Delta at that time, and so it wasn't necessarily in his sound world. But he too was working with roots music, hymns, spirituals, marches, early ragtime, pieces that are also, like the blues, built on pentatonic scales, basic building block harmony 1-4-5. And then he too takes on this modernist deconstruction of that and puts things in different keys and deals with cluster chords and all these things that I'll get into. And so this is, again, from my experience as a contemporary improviser, what really truly resonates with Charles Ives as an inspiration or someone who validates a contemporary improviser and strengthens this relationship between jazz music and jazz improvisation of the last 50 years as this developing American art form that's also circling back to the roots of what an American art music is through the lens, or that's a mixed metaphor, through the soundtrack of Ives. So that's kind of how I'm framing it, this relationship, this juxtaposition between roots and modernism or postmodernism. Now, when you break it down to the next level, there's 3 parts. The biggest part is harmony. Harmony for Ives seemed to be, for its time, toe-to-toe with some of the innovative chromaticism that was going on in Europe, but totally independent and absolutely, what I think, I hear an Americanness because it's not the dodecaphonic kind of 12-tone row of Schoenberg and Webern and that school, the Vienna school, Second Vienna school. It really is delving into, I hear it as a kind of questioning, like, well, what if you take this melody that's in this key and that sounds like this, and I put this other thing over underneath it, or what's the relationship? What if I go to the relative minor? Like the way can only speak from my artistic perspective, but I hear Ives in these kind of harmonic multitudes. And to put it in another way is from an improviser's ear, I hear harmony in Ives not in some kind of strict analytical language. He does have his own language, but I think you could boil it down to rest in motion. Maybe order and chaos. Some people might hear it as that. Both of those things are positives. You have to have one to have the other, right? If you only have like one static thing, it loses its punch. It loses its effectiveness. So for every moment in Ives in the Fourth Symphony, where it sounds like there's 27 things going on at once, and there is, there's a big arrival, right? Both harmonic and often rhythmic, where you're just like, boom, oh, here we are, and just like this beautiful major chord. So there's that juxtaposition in practice. And it's not about following a chord progression or necessarily following a system, right? Like the 12-tone system or something like that. It's following kind of a natural flow of phrasing and ideas and kind of seeing what happens if you stretch kind of the fabric of both melodic or horizontal style harmony and what you could ascribe as kind of vertical harmony. Like the chords are doing this and what's happening on top of it, and they line up. And so there's a couple spaces where Ives has created this wonderful vocabulary that is now, like I said, the lingua franca for contemporary jazz improvisers. The first one is fourths, stacking things in parallel, moving, perfect fourths. And the clearest example is a piece of his called The Cage, which is like a short, like 1 minute piece. And there's this wonderful intro. There's fourths voicings throughout, and there's other things he does, but I want to highlight the fourth voicings in particular on that piece, and especially literally in the first bar, which is kind of an introduction before it's a piece for voice and piano. There's also an instrumental version. And so I've kind of reduced it. It's nice to do some of this stuff on the guitar because you can reduce it, because I can't be the orchestra or can't be a piano. And so you can highlight and clearly hear the sounds. So if you take basically primarily the right hand of his piano part and the intro of The Cage, you get these two stacked fourths. And he likes to move through kind of a shape or a pattern. And so he has this little, and that's kind of the origin of the sound of these fourths. It could be, if we wanted to tie it to a certain tonality, it could be in, E major or C sharp minor, or it could be in D major or B minor. There's a lot of kind of pan modality that's kind of this nebulous space with fourths. Hence the point of the fourths. They have a strong structure because fourths are a strong interval. But they are not necessarily connected to one key at one particular time unless there is a definitive bass line that locks it in. The great thing about Ives, and often a lot of jazz music that explores with fourths, that kind of pedal point might shift, or it might be in a different key, so it gives a sense of kind of a dream world where the harmony is just kind of floating and flowing. So for example, the ending chord isn't actually technically voiced like that for the Ives. It ends like this, which is what I would call a polychord. It's a chord in two keys, which is another thing that he loves to do, is be in two keys simultaneously. This is kind of like an F major 7 with a F sharp minor on top of it. Or you could think of like an A major, a bit of an A major 6 on top of it. Sounds like we're in two keys at once. And depending on what your ear listens to, the top voicing, which sounds consonant, the bottom voicing, which sounds also consonant. You put them together, and you have this wonderful, here's the juxtaposition. Two things that sound beautiful and open and consonant together, played simultaneously, you have this wonderful duality, this contradiction. What key am I supposed to be in? What's the right space? Am I inside the cage? Am I outside the cage? Now I'm getting poetic. But these are questions that, as a listener, maybe Ives is inviting you to ask. Especially if you align the text with what's happening in the music. So now if I put that back together with... So it has this like, kind of strong opening, and then it ends not with a strong resolution, but with this open-ended, contradicting harmonic space. So the fourth set us up to be this floating, dream-like world, and then just when you think, maybe that's where it wants to resolve, right? But it doesn't go there. It goes to this place of two spaces. When I heard this piece, using fourths, or chordal harmony as it's called in jazz quite often, goes back to the 50s and 60s especially, and it's definitely connected to, in particular, primarily one piano player, McCoy Tyner, but also Ahmad Jamal, Bill Evans, other contemporaries, and definitely now any modern player, especially piano, but guitar too. Post-1960s, we all play with chordal harmony because it just opens up the space. And often it might be over like a pedal point. So if I was going to improvise, and again, remember I said this could be in multiple keys, so I might pick a bass note. A jazz improviser might say like, ooh, what interesting movement of fourths. That's definitely way out of whatever key my ear says it's in. It's actually an F. So there's the duality. It's like the F major, A major, or F sharp minor. So he's like toying with this. It's like, hey, I'm in this key. Nope, I'm in this key. Nope, I'm back to that original key. And I'm in both keys. And so as an improviser, what's so great about that, you put up a bass note that's maybe in both keys, like open A. And I might turn that intro of The Cage by Ives into an intro for an improvisation or a piece of my own, or just a solo that might be in D major or B minor or A major or something like that, and be able to move around these fourths like that. So I'll keep going back to that Ives quote as almost like a riff, but I can develop that into some different sounds and solo off that, because those fourths can be also played melodically, not just harmonically. So now I've got... so you have this wonderful kind of movement through those two keys. So I can play in D major or B minor, go to F major really quickly, and then come back home. So there's a lot of different names for that. Pan-modality is a common name. And in a post kind of John Coltrane modal or free music space, that is very common practice. And so, to hear that in The Cage and by Ives, and to hear that in like late Coltrane and artists moving forward all the way up to contemporary artists, this is what I mean by the circle kind of completing, saying like, oh well, this is this American ambiguity, this American juxtaposition, this American contradiction. I'm supposed to be in this key. I'm supposed to be playing like this. I'm in the wrong key. No, you're in the right key. No, you're in both keys. And that's okay. In fact, that's what's interesting about it. Because what's consonant is now dissonant, and what's dissonant can be heard as consonant if you set it up correctly. So I might quote the beginning here. something like that could kind of go all day. And it could open up, like I said, it could be an intro to a piece, it could be original composition, I could write something on top of that, somebody else could solo on top of that with me, but there's this kind of grounding of just by the addition of the pedal or a walking bass line, and then off we go. So there's one of the great examples of kind of that circle completing between improviser and Charles Ives. The other space that's really fascinating is this idea of polytonality, where he sets up, again, it's this idea of using rest in motion, not thinking of conventional harmony, kind of conventional Western European harmony, tonic dominant resolution, nor trying to find a type of prescribed or constructed atonality through 12-tone music, but saying, let's kind of blur the space and have rest and motion happen simultaneously, create that density and that versus clarity by stacking different keys on top of one another and kind of playing with our expectations and having different sounds of rest and motion emerge from the background into the foreground and vice versa. And if you look at, there's a couple different spots. One of the first space I heard this, where I was like, hey, this is what's happening in jazz music and has been, since at least the late 40s with bebop, is in the first movement of the Fourth Symphony, when the chorus comes in with Watchmen Tell Us of the Night. And there's this great moment. They start out in D major, and it's a simple hymn, right? Setting of a song that he had arranged and found its way into the symphony. So, right. So that's the vocal line, and you can harmonize it in a bunch of ways. In fact, the orchestra does come in pretty much in D major. There's some swirling ambiguity. There's also a great Charles Ivesism where even when the melody is clearly like in D major or D pentatonic major, he's going to go to the relative minor, but not quite always in the relative minor. So you're like, oh, is it a bright tune in D major? No, it's a sad, melancholy piece in B minor. Oh, nope, now it's in a completely different key. And it's very... he obfuscates what's happening, and that's just wonderful. That's the juxtaposition, because no answer in life is easy. I think that's what he's saying, right? We live in a space full of contradictions and challenges and navigations of struggles, but you can find beauty in all of that. At least that's how I hear it. And so if I hear, so it might... he might do something like that and put the A might be in a different key, might go to F. I put it in E flat. And from the score, what he does at that moment when there's a resolution, and it's for a moment he was like, there you could hear part of the orchestra is in B minor, so it's like, right, so he's maybe there, and then when it ends there, he plays an E, which is the 4 chord if you're in B minor. It's the 2 chord if you're in D major. So it almost doesn't even matter. Like, you're going to hear at different moments. I like to, if I need to analyze it and kind of explain what's happening, I kind of hear that moment going from a minor 1 to a dominant 4 chord. And, because here's the kicker. So he goes, yeah. plays a dominant, what I would call in jazz parlance, an E7 flat 13, and then the piano goes and plays this F natural up top, the flat 9, and that's where you kind of get, the C is already saying, something's not right. Are we really in B minor? Where are we? It's an altered 5 chord kind of, or altered 4 chord, altered 4 chord. And then that little trinkle way up there says, oh, what's happening out there? And if you look along with the text, and it says, tell us, watchmen of the night, it's asking a question. They're asking the us. They're asking the watchman, what's happening out there, and I kind of don't know. Like there's this ambiguity, which is I love it. That was one of my first kind of moments in my own Ives journey, where I was like, oh wow, I could hear multiple keys at once, and where's it coming from? And kind of hearing a jazz, my ear heard it as this jazz chord, but also spread out. Like I can also voice it. I can voice it like this, right? So you hear the strong E major. It's like, hey, this is B minor. And then it goes to, that has a strong pull, like 1, minor 1, 4, minor 1. That's a good hymn. That's a good American Protestant hymn. But you put that moment with this F in there, and then as he's voiced it, maybe next to the root again. That's another thing that Ives loves to do, is kind of cluster things up to make it a little bit more blurry, muddy the waters, hide things again. So that's fascinating to me, because all of a sudden you've got this. I hear that as a jazz chord, a 13, an E7 flat 13 flat 9 chord. It's a very kind of hip modern jazz chord from the last 50 years or so. Coming out of the bebop vocabulary, but definitely a part of contemporary improvisers, where you use the altered scale, or you have all these different options to go in and out of the key. And so, here's this space from, decades earlier, where we have this hint at this ability to go out. What an improviser might do is say, ooh, if there's an F and a C in there, I might play over the E, not in B minor or E, but I might play a B flat major pentatonic, and that's called the tritone sub. It's their tritone apart, which goes back to goes back to Duke Ellington in the 30s, but the beboppers really use that a lot in their music as well. And I hear Ives using the quote-unquote bebop tritone substitution all throughout his work. But it gave me this entry into understanding a different role of how those harmonies work and how to use them. And not say like, oh, they can only be used on a 5 chord, or they can only be used here. They can be kind of open up this world of what it means to play rest in motion on a different level, and hint at 2 keys at once. So I might be able, I might be playing, Tell Us Watchman. So I could go in and out of D major, B minor, hit that 4 chord, play the 5 chord of D. I went to B flat major explicitly, and played a little fill. So as an improviser, I could deconstruct that melody and move freely between all major keys, but use those major keys as a sense of momentum or motion instead of rest. So that's one of my favorite tools of Ives, is that he uses rest for motion, and sometimes where you expect motion, he's supposed to give you rest. So for example, another example, I might pivot to the fourth movement of his, or the fourth ragtime dance, his ragtime pieces, and which is basically the whole thing. All four pieces are all stretching out an old hymn, bringing in the sheaves. So another folk tune, Protestant folk hymn, pentatonic primarily, and he's doing all that. I mean, you can sum up everything about Ives in those four ragtime pieces. First of all, the harmony stuff, chordal harmony, clusters, polytonality, but also the rhythmic stuff, which I'll get to in a second. All four of the ragtime pieces are melodically kind of this super clever deconstruction, ripping apart, reinventioning of bringing in the sheaves. But my favorite part is the end, in terms of highlighting his sense of polytonality and this juxtaposition or contradiction of what's rest, what's motion, and inverting that sometimes. It comes at the end in a classic kind of Ives space where he goes into his dream world after all this intense time and rhythm and groove, and we'll talk about that in a second too, how he's using the density of rhythm and time versus this floating rubato space where it's not even rubato, it's just very slow, and it just suddenly the density just clears out and it becomes just translucent and things are just kind of floating. It's like a dream as the piece drifts off. And he's been quoting this piece all along, and at the end he quotes it finally, kind of very clearly, in B flat. Very pretty, like that. And then it goes to the 4 chord. And then, it goes up. Where's it going? Yes. That's how it should end. That's how the piece normally ends. And so he starts out with and then instead of that moment right there, he changes keys and he plays this. A great melodic device that Ives uses to hint at creating tension. He'll play the melody or quote the melody, but just up a half step or down a half step. And it's just enough to kind of tweak your ears and say, whoa, something's off, something's wrong. We're supposed to be resolving there. Why aren't we resolving? And it's that lovely duality. And the chord, so he's on the 4 chord there, and he does this wonderful inversion. I kind of stole this chord from Charles Ives, and it's not a typical guitar chord, as you can see my fingers. He's playing a major 7 chord. I played it the first time, right, and just a beautiful jazz chord, but he inverts it and takes this cluster of the major 7 in the root, spreads it to a flat 9, and puts the 3rd in the bass. And that sounds like you're not in a key at all. Although if you're listening carefully, like that's still, he's still kind of in the same key. It's like, hey, that's the right change. Doesn't sound like it anymore. And then the next chord that comes in, like on the piano, is this. He goes to E major. We were in the key of B flat. Now he goes to E major over an F. And there's our tritone sub again. And so he's moved us away, and that could be heard as being in the key of E. So he's pivoted, and we're supposed to be in the one chord, right? And then he does the final quote. So it's like and he just chromatically, very subtle chromatically, this is in the violins and pianos. And he hits the 5 chord there, still in the bass, the B flat is there. And then the strings resolve to B flat. Then the piano says, which is an A major triad. And so if you're thinking, oh, well, and so that just, again, dream world, it's like super pianissimo, just floating off. You're like, what just happened there? And then you notice that like the bass is still ringing. So your ear follows this tonality. It's like, doesn't make any sense. And then it focuses back on the cello and bass. And you're like, oh, we're still in B flat. So it gives us this like B flat. No, we're not in B flat. Then guess what the tritone sub of the 4 chord is? Oh, it's A. So he's done another tritone sub for our usual plagal cadence, which is at the end of every hymn, right? So we've got this, should end like, that's some good church resolution right there, right? And so he says, yeah, I'm going to give you the church resolution, but it's going to be, and your ear kind of floats away with that, and then the bass and cello come back in, and your ear finally resolves back to B flat. So you have this constant kind of playing against polytonality, multiple keys, and they're both functioning as like 5-1 or 1-4-1. It's really quite a beautiful thing because he hasn't done anything separately super strange. He hasn't like done all these kind of hip reharmonization and taken into these different keys. He's done this one simple tool, the tritone sub, and it played 5-1 in one key and then 1-5-1-4-1 in the other key that following the melody, but happening together at the same time. So your ear's constantly being torn. So when you talk about juxtaposition / contradiction, I can't think of a better harmonic example. And so in jazz, that happens all the time, like passing chords. That could happen. Yeah. You can move around chromatically all the time. Like jazz pianists do that ever since Art Tatum. So there is this language continuity between kind of bebop reharmonization and the tritone sub that now again comes full circle with Ives and this idea of polytonality. It's fascinating to me, this kind of role where this is supposed to be rest. So here's this example of where rest is supposed to be rest, and he superimposes this motion on it yet again. Like we're supposed to be simple, finish the song, we're at rest, amen, literally the amen plagal cadence, and he says, yes, we're not resting. Oh, yes, we are. That's just awesome. And for an improviser to kind of mess with that and play in two keys at once, a lot of players now, in like I said, in the last, especially the last like 20, 25, 30 years, definitely into creating like a certain harmonic, tonal space. And moves in and out fluidly, not changing keys, just passing through these tonalities as a way to color the improvisation, always resolving back home to your home key. But in surprising ways and sometimes overlapping ways where your ear gets pulled like, oh, we're in this key now. Oh, no, that was just the thing. Okay. So that's something really to keep in mind, I think is one of the greatest harmonic treasures of Ives's music, and it connects it to this kind of roots versus modernism, because the harmonies are not conceptually on the surface very challenging. It's just that he's layering things, ingredients, like a good sandwich. Like, well, this is just a major triad, and then I put this major triad, and then this minor triad on it, and it sounds we're in three keys at once, and then your ear, based on the orchestration, tells you which way to go. So for an improviser to do that too, it's liberating in the modern sense. We can improvise now off the melody instead of the form, and saying we must play off the 5 chord or must play off the 4 chord here. We're going to play off the melody and keep that melody going, but maybe I should be in B flat, but maybe I do something where I put that totally, if I was just doing like the tritone subs, I could do something like. And just improvise. So I wasn't following the harmonic motion of the original piece. I was creating my own harmonic arc by just moving the melody around and improvising off of that. So it's very, very liberating for a modern improviser to deal with improvisation, not on a harmonic grid, but on in a linear space, following the melody and reharmonizing it by stacking tonalities. So the final thing, speaking of stacking things, the final modernist thing that Ives is so good at, and this definitely changes the energy and he's so good at changing the energy. And again, this is about contradictions and juxtapositions. It's with rhythm and time, and specifically polyrhythm or polytime, being in two different either meters or tempos at the same time. And you look through or listen through Putnam's Camp, 3 Places in New England, Symphony No. 4. I'm going to actually stay on the ragtime pieces, ragtime No. 4, because there's a great kind of mini example that I can highlight very easily. But he's doing these polyrhythmic, or what I call polytime, because it really sounds like there's 2 different temporal spaces going on at the same time. And this definitely, we have hints of this all throughout jazz, 2/3, 3/2, certain syncopations. But again, we don't have like this deep exploration of polytime and polymeters and polyrhythms until really the last 50 years or so of jazz improvisation. And so, to hear that, this is what I know for myself and also for a lot of my jazz colleagues when we listen to Ives he's writing this, so it's not about swing or groove, right? He's writing this before the language of swing, before Armstrong, while Armstrong's a kid. So it's not about like swinging or playing like blues phrasing or that type of thing. It's about using a certain layering of rhythm to create density and to create energy, motion, and then create sudden moments of rest. And if you listen through any of Ives's more dense material and try to follow in the score, you will find like, okay, there is polytime or polyrhythm happening in some layer. And what I love about it is he's using that as a vehicle to create kind of this warp speed of density. And then he doesn't do it to just create chaos. It's not about chaos, even though we think of this juxtaposition of chaos and order. It is really about these arrival points. He always arrives on like a big beat, what we call in jazz, like the big beat, where we might do something rhythmically complicated for a bar, 2 bars, maybe 4 bars if the band trusts us all. And we'll stretch it out, and then we'll all hit, boom, on this big 1 or something like that. And if you look through his marches, in particular like Putnam's Camp or the ragtime pieces, he does that all over the place. Just when you're like, what is happening? There's a boom, a big 1, and you're like, oh, we're here. Now he might change the meter on you at that big 1. He might do some harmonic things to help everything snap into focus. Like, hey, and now we're also in the same key. Cool. So there's these big arrivals, these big moments of rest that are very powerful and quite arresting. And it gives us this sense of ebb and flow. And I think it highlights, again, the theme of the role of this Americanness of contradiction and how effective and how actually you can celebrate that contradiction because they stand up side by side and work well together. So meditate on that as you will. But the thing I want to highlight, what he did, there's this one moment, and if you want to get specific, I can get specific. It's in the fourth ragtime piece, the last 2 bars of letter H. It's an 8-bar phrase, as a ragtime piece might be. And right before, so these are the 2 bars before J, and it's a bringing in the sheaves moment. So that melody's going on, and it's like this kind of march beat kind of thing, and it's in 1 key. It's in F at this time, and what he does here is at the end of the phrase, so he's got boom, 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 it does this weird little end, as he likes to do at the end of a phrase, because he wanted to give you, it's too easy to resolve as expected. Kind of gives it to you, then takes it away. He defies your expectation. I think this is, I hear it as this little game that he plays in the music. He's prepping your ear to have the expected resolution, and then says, no. And so at that moment where it's supposed to go, and he does this little chromatic thing, and then it's like goes right back to it, next strain, right back into it. But on this moment where he doesn't go, but goes, the tuba part plays, it's starting out going like boom 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 ba-dum, boom 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 ba-dum. That's what it should be, right? And it doesn't do that. Instead, in those last 2 bars, it plays, so we're in 4/4, and it plays 4/3 on beats 1, 2, and 3, and then hits on 4 together, again with the tritone in the bass of the F, the 1 chord, and it really throws everything off and throws us in this kind of, talk about this contradiction or defying expectations. So what that sounds like, it's, it should be something simple like that, 3, 4, and he's going, I'll do it kind of simply first, and so you can hear the polyrhythm, but the tuba part is, there's that 4. So it goes right into that. So it's like, and then boom, drops right back into, you don't know where we are. 4. And then off it goes again, and then it kind of unravels and then snaps back together. And I love that moment of just kind of defying the expectations and creating the tension. But that's just a little kernel that highlights the excitement of what's poly time, because you can hear it sounds like we're in 1, 2, 3, 4, while this other thing's going in 3 beats slower, and then there's this whole bigger march beat that's going boom, 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 boom. So it's 3 levels of time, and it really starts to unravel the fabric of where we think the pulse is. And it's kind of unsettling, but it also, in its own way, kind of grooves and swings in a more contemporary fashion. And then it snaps back, and then we're right back into our march. So there's a rhythmic example, a very detailed rhythmic example of how Ives can use, again, juxtaposition or contradiction. Right? You start messing with people's sense of time and rhythm, in their music, that's when they can start to get kind of disgruntled or confused. Like, where's one? Which beat is right? What am I supposed to listen to? And he gives it just enough. It's not like the whole piece just goes off the rails, right? It's just a couple beats, and then snaps right back to the groove. The next time through, the second ending, it introduces a waltz, and it puts bringing in the sheaves into a waltz in 3/4. It's supposed to be in 4/4. And that's also, he does that a lot, kind of, again, defying the expectation. It's supposed to be this. I will play that melody for you, but now it's in 3. It's a waltz. Surprise! And then it goes back, and then it ends with that ballad thing where I ended. So just with that harmonic framing and some of this rhythmic framing stuff in terms of polyrhythm and polytime, just those 2 super detailed ingredients are enough, I think, for the modern improviser to say, this is beyond a kindred spirit. There is a blueprint that developed independently that has now kind of found this space as being this common practice. And now you have this whole generation of musicians that have checked out the history of jazz, especially, or experimental music, that explored all that independently. And then now it's like reinforced by the Ives language. And I think this is just, again, my opinion, kind of an educated, experiential opinion as an educator, composer, and improviser. I think now is the time that Ives's vocabulary is actually the most richly implemented into American improvisation. Like the Ives's time, his time is now, more than any other time in the 20th century for improvisers. And like I said, for me, that completes this amazing circle of American music and how contradiction and juxtaposition can be such an elemental, aesthetic, and philosophical space for an American artist to create.